This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Brock Swinson, who is the founder of Creative Screenwriting Magazine. He hosts the podcast Creative Principles, which publishes episodes, a lot of episodes. I don't know how you have time, frankly, to do all that you do. And he's also the author of the forthcoming book about screenwriting and creative productivity called Ink by the Barrel. Brock, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here.
All right, so let's start with, how did you get into screenwriting?
I mean, to go way, way back, it's like we're definitely a family who talks in movie quotes. We watched a bunch of Westerns. I think I saw Psycho when I was like 6 years old and all kinds of stuff like that. So I went to school kind of meandering, won a couple writing awards when I was a kid, didn't really like anything else, learned screenwriting at UNC Wilmington a little bit, but it really wasn't till like I kind of quit everything I was doing, took a long road trip, ended up in LA with a friend of mine. He got me some jobs working on commercials and some weird TV shows like Guinness Book of Records. We got to watch people break records every day or attempt to. But that's where I actually got the job for. So actually, just one little correction: I work screenwriting and then I host Creative Principles. They are linked together though. So
Okay.
I'm one of the contributing writers for the magazine, and that's what's kind of led, somewhere 5 years in, I said, hey, we should be using this great audio we have. And they kind of just said, you can have it, do what you want. So I wanted to call it something different, just so I could talk to more than just screenwriters. I talk to authors and chefs and musicians and really whoever I can kind of reach out to. And luckily, some of the clout of the magazine has led to these big interviews. And now I can kind of reach out to some bigger names and actually get them on the show. And yeah, we're over 400 episodes now. So really great.
Amazing.
Yeah, and there's so much crossover. Like, I like the title Creative Principles because regardless of whether you're a chef or an author or, whatever your pursuit, there is so much crossover among the creativity that can go into those things to fill that creative well and give you that, satisfaction of doing those things. Is that what you found as well?
Yeah, and I feel like, and maybe it's just doing the show so long, I feel like I see those things better than most people, maybe. Just like I can hear a chef talking about something and I'll relate it back to writing, or I can hear somebody talking about struggling with their diet. And I'm like, well, that's a discipline that's also in writing. I see a lot of overlap. There's a book called Range that kind of talks about this too, how really the people who make some of the breakthroughs are coming in from a total third party perspective and they just look at things in a very new way. And I've kind of seen some of that in the many interviews I've done.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I'm trying to think about an interview that I'm only partially remembering now, but it was an accountant who went into this entirely. Oh, I know what it was. It was on Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives.
Yeah.
And it was this accountant, and he like had quit his accounting job to start a restaurant and become a chef. And he's like, you know, I don't know what correlation there is between those things, but it reminded me of what you just said of like you have people moving from one space to another. They're able to take the discipline they've learned in one, apply it to the other, and start a new business that maybe it satisfies them in ways that the others didn't. And I know that, Barb and I have talked about, so she's a retired lawyer. I have law practice, how we have used so many of the things that we have learned in our training as lawyers, applying it to the writing businesses and the writing crafts.
I love those stories. There's that book and movie. I'm thinking of the movie Up in the Air when George Clooney is firing people and he talks to J.K. Simmons about what did you really want to be before they paid you to give up on your dream. And I think so many people kind of find that later in life. And I don't know, there's so many great stories. I mean, that Colonel Sanders started that business at age 65. The guy, I forget his name, the guy who wrote A River Runs Through It, he was in his 80s when that book came out about his childhood. I mean, there's so many. Like I encourage so many people, just like it's not really ever too late. And the sooner you kind of start, the quicker you can get into it.
Yeah, like it's only too late if you don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's absolutely right. And I'm certainly far older than either of you, both of your mothers. And so in my peer group, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, I just didn't start that, or they continue working jobs that they're good at. So they feel it's leisurely and they're well paid at this point in their careers. but it's just soul sucking. And they just say, well, I don't know what else I would do. And so I think all of this, like what you're talking about, what you put out in the world, Brock, is wonderful because people need that little kernel of encouragement that, yeah, you can do other things. It's not, I think people who don't do that think, well, you're either born as a creative or you're not.
Yeah.
That is absolutely not true. We all have a wellspring of creativity.
Yeah, you can definitely like turn on the creativity in your mind. It's almost like your own internal search engine, I think. I think that's what's so great about all these podcasts is that people
Yeah.
can listen because you really do need to see someone break through the wall so you can do it. You need to see it kind of happen.
Mhm.
Doing some of these shows, like in hindsight now, I see that like both of my parents had pretty normal jobs. My dad was in sales, but he always loved music. He produced a bluegrass album at some point. My mother was a receptionist, but she loved to paint. My grandmother's in her 80s. She's published 2 books of poetries and she published her third book and like she's around 84. So I mean,
Wow.
seeing that firsthand is really kind of just, I don't know, like I really don't remember having conversations where they encouraged me, but I just kind of saw what they really wanted to do maybe. And that kind of led me to like, well, everything's hard. Why not take your chance, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a big difference between what I do, where I have the professional career, and then I write novels. I've written some nonfiction books, and it's a side hustle.
Yeah.
As compared to making that creative work your career, and that's your living. So for you, starting, in those early years, how did you go about, like, I guess I've read, this is this is a terrible question. It's going on really long, but like I read Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert a couple
Yeah.
times now, and she talks about that, the danger of forcing your art to pay for your life. And
Yeah.
so how did you manage that and do the creative work and make that your career?
I mean, I'm still very much in that phase where I write. I mean, I write to pay the bills, but I also write kind of for pleasure. And I'm trying to break in a multitude of ways. I'll kind of hit on some touch points because when I start talking, it does sound like this guy's all over the map a bit, you know. So I've always been trying to write screenplays. I've raised money to make my first documentary. I'm working on that now. I've been a ghostwriter as well. I've done a little bit of everything through like sites like Upwork. And now I also teach people how to do that. We're doing an upcoming challenge where I'll teach people how to get their first client in 5 days, stuff like that. So I've been a
Right.
copywriter for 10 years. I kind of worked like it's very odd because when I think back about these things, whenever I followed some bit of curiosity, that led me to the magazine. The magazine was a job on Craigslist, and I've been there for 10 years. I also wrote $10 an article for a I wrote about the TV show The Walking Dead. Like it was like nothing. I was like, oh, I like the show. I'll try this out. It was no money. And that led to like we grew a platform over 1 million people. I was doing a Facebook Live with 60,000 people. That didn't really monetize well for the owner, but he referred me to ClickFunnels. I got at ClickFunnels and I was writing copy alongside John Parks, the VP of marketing. He like taught me marketing. I wrote copy for Russell Brunson, Grant Cardone, Tony Robbins, Dean Graciosi. And just like these odd paths kind of led me in that way. But copywriting's always paid the bills. I've also written like 10 books as a ghostwriter. I've really like just started like, okay, now I'm going to start doing my own thing. I'm giving this first book away for free. I'm making my own courses. I'm getting online, doing things more than just kind of hosting the podcast, but it's definitely kind of a variety. I like to have a multitude of things going on. You have to really figure out, okay, this is enough money for me now, but I also want to do this. And I know some of the other things are going to pay off in the long run. And that's really why I talk about being prolific, is like I'm thinking about this for a lifetime, not just trying to get rich quick, not putting so much pressure that I want to be the next Tarantino or JD Salinger or something like that. Just like chipping away, get better, focus on doing it for a lifetime.
Well, and I think, and I want to take this to something Barbara's done because it so closely resembles what you just mentioned. Um, Following these different curiosities, taking these different jobs, you never know where it's going to lead.
Mhm.
Barb has talked about before how she wrote about Downton Abbey,
Hmm.
and it led to a bunch of other opportunities. And I think it's been a while since you've talked about that. So Barb, tell that story because it so closely remembers or resembles what Brock was talking about The Walking Dead.
It really does. That is so interesting. When I publish in my main genre would be women's fiction. So in the early days, back in I guess it was 2013, I had one book out, and I'm trying to build a Facebook presence and all of that. And I got a consultant who said, form a community page based around an idea that people will go to that Facebook page, and then you can post your author stuff there and draw them to your author page.
Mhm.
And they were saying, oh, I love to read or whatever. No, Downton Abbey was in its second season and it was a phenomenon. So I said, I'm going to do Downton Abbey fans. Right decision.
Mhm.
40,000 likes in the first month, for heaven's sakes. Now it's like over 200,000 fans, and it's all on autopilot, basically. I rarely have to post new content now. It just recycles all this and it goes and goes. I've had offers to buy it. I've had, as a result of that page, then I built my author page up to, I think I'm at 40 plus thousand now on that. But I also became the Downton Abbey reviewer on cultbox.uk.co,
Mhm.
which is kind of like their Entertainment Tonight, because their reviewer was injured in a car accident. This is on a Tuesday. The review has to post on Thursday. I'm, of course, working full time, and I've never reviewed a TV show before, but they contacted me through my Facebook page and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I, of course, said the only thing you would say, of course I will. That's what, midnight to 6 a.m. is for, is to watch Down Abbey on your screen, take notes, and write a review, which I did. And so I continued that through the rest of the seasons and did some other shows on that. And it was one of those things, the Downton Abbey page itself didn't necessarily monetize, but it became such a platform for all kinds of fun things that I'm so glad I did it. So part of this, as you're talking about, Brock, is you can't swing at every pitch that comes to you.
Yeah.
And it gets overwhelming. And I keep telling myself, well, how much better is it to be overwhelmed by opportunities than to be sitting at my desk thinking, oh, how can I get something going? It's nice to have too much and just have to listen to your intuitive sense of things to say yes and no to things. And you're not always going to be right, but what the heck?
Yeah, and these were two success stories, but I mean, there was 100 failures, and that's fine too. You're just kind of
Yes.
like figuring
Yeah.
out what works. I call this borrowed authority. I think the idea I maybe heard from a book called The Third Door about kind of breaking in, but so I'm using now to kind of get on some of these podcasts and things, borrowed authority of that I've interviewed Jim Gaffigan, Ethan Hawke, Aaron Sorkin, Whitney Cummings, whatever. So I'm
Wow.
kind of leaning into that. And then that's why I'm getting the same reason I'm giving so much away. I'm doing these things where borrowed authority. Okay, I know this person. I don't know this guy running it, but I know all these people he's talking about. I'll check him out. He's giving away a free book. He's giving away an audiobook. He's doing a free challenge. That way I can show them like how much work I'm putting into things, because you're just trying to break that barrier and get people to trust you. And eventually you're going to find a handful of people who are going to buy whatever your next thing is. Like hopefully if I give the first book away, I plan to write a book every 2 years, I'll sell the next one. And I'm just approaching it very much that way. And that comes from working with probably Russell Brunson and Pace Morby the most, two guys I've worked with who really believe in this go giver mindset. Every act of giving something is also an act of receiving. That's kind of the basic idea. But the more you give it away, call it karma or whatever, I think it will
Yeah.
work out in the end.
I think so too.
Agree.
And you talked about following curiosities, and one of the things I really like reading about and listening to podcasts about is behavioral economics, which I know sounds like super dull, but I think it's really interesting, and a lot of listening to shows like that, and Freakonomics and all these other podcasts that don't have anything to do with my work or my creativity. They lead to places that I would have never guessed, like
Mhm.
and lead to meeting people who I never would have expected, or had an opportunity otherwise to come in contact with. And so, I totally forgot where I was going with that. So let me go a different direction here. one of the chapters in your book, you talk about, and Ink by the Barrel is about a lot of things, and included in that is getting your creative work done. We've talked about all the different things that you are doing, and you still have to get the creative work done, so that not only so that you can pay the bills now, but also looking down the road. And there are so many distractions available to us. One of the analogies you use is keeping the world small. And I really liked that. I thought it was super effective, and you pulled it together well. Can you tell the story about keeping the world small, and what that means and how we can implement it?
Yeah, kind of. I think it's chapter 5. I start that talking about the Zack Snyder movie Superman. Superman's a kid. He's just a little kid. He's at school and it's overwhelming. He's seeing X-ray vision through his teacher. All the sounds are coming in. We know him for his powers later, but he's yet able to control those powers. So he's kind of just like overwhelmed until his mother kind of talks to him while he's kind of in the fetal position and says, "Look, you got to make your world small." And whenever the pressure is like that, the same thing. So I'm working on an 8-hour documentary right now. That's overwhelming. I couldn't have done it 10 years ago. But I have to do things like I have to break it up into 8 episodes. I have to break each episode up into different parts and then really just focus on what the next thing is. That's really the only way to do any of these things. And the way I kind of bounce between them. So I'm writing my next book now. I use Ron Holiday's note card system. So all I'm doing is every time I read something or hear something I like, I throw it in a pile. That's later. I'll work on that later. Right now is this. I've got a few clients I work with. I try to create accountability whenever I can. The one thing I've kind of found, and I've probably done, 7 versions of this, and I like to change things up, but I always go tangible, meaning like some physical bit of paper is always like inevitable for me. If I'm doing 4 things on my computer, it's boring, it's dull. David Sedaris said, like, when he writes on his typewriter, and if it was a terrible day, but there's balls of paper on the floor, there's some sign of progress there. So even if you're kind of a failure to some degree for that day. But I'm working with a coach a little bit too. And he said, well, look, every day you list 5 or 10 things you're trying to do. You can really only successfully do 3. And that's more of like how I feel throughout the day. If I have 10 things down, it's always overwhelming. If I have 3 down, I might get done by lunch. I might do 10 things, but I only have to do 3. And what I'll do is like, okay, June 1st, I'm going to film 30 videos for a course. I've got like 30 other projects I'm working on and these are like incremental steps of maybe 2 projects, right? So I'll print all those out. And if you're only doing 3 things a day, you've only got about 90 slots. So I'll list 45 or 50 or maybe more than that. And I'll leave some openings for necessary things, but that makes me think like it's on paper. This is what I promised myself I would do. I call them non-negotiables. These are things that have to get done. They can extend beyond to some degree if it has to, because it's maybe more complicated than I thought, but I can't throw it away. Because I feel like when things are just in my phone, I'm like, I'll just do the first 3 easy things. I always do that. And then when you're just looking at how many spots you have open, it's more like, okay, is this the same caliber as everything else I printed out? Is this worth going on here? And within that, there's a balance of things you're paid for, things that are passion projects, things that you just have to get done for whatever reason. And I'll literally print these out and I'm keeping them in my pocket because we're traveling a lot this summer. So I want to kind of keep it on me. I want to think about it when I get up in the morning. What's my next 3 things that absolutely have to happen to achieve what I said I was going to do this month?
I love hearing that. I don't feel like such a dinosaur because I do like paper and I love me crossing off something out from the list. That is just the best. And sometimes I write really small things on a list just so I have stuff to cross off and make myself feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
But I like
Yeah.
this idea of switching medium that you're using.
Yeah.
And so I normally type on my laptop. Like when I get up in the morning, I get up early so that before anybody else in the house is up, I can spend 45 minutes, hopefully working on a novel. And so I normally do that on my laptop. But there's times when I'm just like, it's this weekend, for example, I Sunday morning got like 284 words, and it's this chapter, that in my outline, it looked like it should have been an easy chapter to write, but it was tough. And every one of those 280 words that I got was well earned that morning, because like it was just hard to write. And sometimes I find that if I'll just switch, and I use Scrivener when I write. And so if I just go from my laptop, and then if I have some time in the afternoon, and instead of the laptop, I use my iPad that has a keyboard, like there
Yeah.
is nothing functionally different, but
Right.
something is different. And the words, maybe it's the gap in time and things have just been percolating in the background. I don't know, but sometimes, changing formats of, whether it's writing or using a typewriter or whatever tool you're using, it makes a different connection to your brain,
Yeah.
between your brain and your fingers. And sometimes that's just what you need to be able to get the work done.
Yeah, I mean, and if I'm really feeling, I usually like outline so much that it's not too terrible when I get time to actually write. But if I, a lot of times though, like to get like super granular, I'll have a page open and I'll just use the Mac sticky notes, and it literally just like makes it smaller. Like 4 words is like has like half a sentence to look at. So I use that all the time for like just regular notes. And if I'm writing a description for a podcast, something like that, it's very tiny, but I'll just throw some stuff like that in there and throw it together. And then you've got something to kind of get you started. Like all of it is like some way to start the momentum, some way to like trick your brain into starting and just getting past the like overwhelm that we all inevitably feel with a blank page.
Yeah. The other thing I do is I'll just take my laptop and go somewhere else in the house, sit somewhere else, even if it's not as comfortable. But sometimes you just need to change it up a little bit. I was going to say, Jeremy is, he isn't telling you this, but I will tell you, he's the master of the Excel spreadsheet. His spreadsheets are legendary and would make me absolutely crazy because I'm not very good at Excel. I have to admit that, but he's the king of it.
All right. So changing tracks a little bit and definitely changing away from me. One of the parts of your book is about finding your voice.
Mhm.
And before I ever finished my first novel, I had two other novels that I had quit, and, a half dozen short stories and a lot of other writing along the way before I got to that novel that was the first one I finished, and really found the way that I wanted to tell stories, and, that fit me, because there was a lot of time spent chasing my, I went through an Ernest Hemingway phase. I think a lot of people who write novels and read the classics try to emulate these past masters. But one of the chapters in your book is about finding your voice, is in part about making it personal.
Mhm.
So talk about, for you, what that journey went from putting all of the work in that enables you to find your voice and be able to tell stories in a way that are personal to you.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I use the word prolific so much, the subtitle of the book is Secrets from Prolific Writers. I'm just kind of obsessed with that idea. The podcast itself is about creativity plus productivity. So that's kind of how I think about prolific and being a long-term writer. But you almost like, I think you find quality through quantity. You have to write a bit. You have to try on voices, as you said. So many, I've talked to a lot of comedians. They all say, well, I'll go out there right now. I'm going to talk kind of like Seinfeld, or I'm going to talk like Mulaney. And they're just getting like every time you do a performance or publish or write something or even write something and throw it away, you're creating leverage for yourself to identify yourself as a writer and be a writer. And I think eventually, whether it's maybe it's a bad first novel or a couple of bad screenplays or whatever, you're going to find some theme that you naturally gravitate towards and you can't help but write about it. You look at some of the greats. I mean, Tarantino, every movie is about like a 70s era revenge story. That's what he writes about. He's obsessed with that idea. Paul Schrader, who wrote, I've talked to Paul Schrader. He wrote Taxi Driver, he wrote First Reformed. He's got a new movie out now. He's been doing this for 50 years. Every single movie he writes is about a kind of an anti-hero heading towards a violent catharsis. That's like what his movies are about, undeniably. The same is true for Parasite that won the Oscar a few years ago. All of his movies are about class warfare. I think like I'm kind of working with his coach now. He said you really need to find like a life purpose for yourself that connects to your writing. I do write a lot of my stuff is similar to what Paul Schrader likes. So I do kind of look at those movies as an example. They help me with some of my like scaffolding for character and that type of thing. But I think like I saw the show True Detective. There's one line where Russ Cole says something like, "The world needs bad men. They keep other bad men away from the door." And that is a deep character moment. And I feel like every character I ever write has some bit of that in him. And that almost like helps me know what the next idea is going to be, even though the worlds are very different. The characters are very different. But somewhere within that is like, I'm just obsessed with that idea. I think it's like it's kind of like going back to old martial arts and stuff like that. But I'm just obsessed with that ideas and characters.
Yeah, and I found this similar thing in my own work that, so my first four novels were all fantasy novels. The one I'm writing now is not. And they're dark and they tell these dark stories. But I have found that in all four of those were stories about family
Mhm.
and hope and love, and like terrible things are happening, but these things are still existing and permeating throughout the story. And like, that's, I think that those things are important to me, that, even in our darkest timelines, we need to be able to see those things. And that has made its way into the story of, it's not something I'm thinking about as I'm writing the story, and certainly not, like line by line. But
Mhm.
those are things that when I think about these stories after I've told them, and they are what they're going to be, those are things that exist within them, and I'm glad to find it there because it's important. So yeah, I think that's really interesting.
That gives you that freedom too, because you know you're possibly going to end in an optimistic manner. But to get to that, you have to go through some pretty tough stuff. So you get to kind of do both of those. I love doing. I mean, a lot of times figuring out one character, your other character is the mirror image, and you can just kind of things naturally unfold. So going back to my very first interview, I spoke with this guy named Blake Masters. I just got this job. I hadn't been to LA very long. I'm driving to see him at a restaurant, and he wrote the movie Two Guns. It's Denzel Washington, Mark Wahlberg. Every billboard I see is his movie, and I'm going to meet him in person. And I just hadn't been out of college very long. And he just told me, it's like, I think at the time I was writing bad characters, probably based on Judd Apatow or whatever was popular. And I was like, oh, this character would be cool if he did these 10 things. And he would call it throwing ornaments on a tree. He's like, well, no, what you really should decide. And based on that movie, he said Denzel Washington will do whatever it takes. Mark Wahlberg has a moral code. That's the whole story. Every scene, every bit of comedy, every bit of action goes back to those two elements played out over and over and over again. So it's like once you find that, everything unravels from that because he believes this one idea. He went to college here, he got this job, he did that. So it's like when you find that theme that you're obsessed with, everything else just kind of naturally unravels after that.
So this is changing tracks and kind of getting close to the end of the interview. One of the things I've thought about, as we interview all these authors, you've interviewed hundreds of folks for your podcast. You talked about, some of the social proof that provides, but for your end, it's also creating relationships. And in fact, mine and Barb's relationship exists because I reached out to her several years ago about doing a podcast interview for a different podcast I was doing. And, my friendship with her and with other people has developed out of that. Um, when For people who form relationships, and some of them are fleeting, and you'll do an interview and maybe not talk to them again, and other times that you'll stay in touch. When have you found, trying to figure out the right way to word this, that it's okay to lean on that relationship for an idea that you have, or a project you want to work on or put out in the world?
So a lot of mine, just the nitty gritty stuff, is like if it's someone super famous and it's for the magazine, it's usually some PR middleman like connecting us. But over the years, I mean, once in a while, someone will surprise me. I talked to William Monahan. I was obsessed with his work. He wrote The Departed. He wrote like 3 or 4, like Body of Lies, a couple of DiCaprio movies. And at the end of the interview, he just said, "Hey, man, let me give you my personal email. If you have any questions, let me know." And it was just like mind blowing. At the time, I still had this other job, and I was like, "People just do that?" You know, it didn't make any sense. But since then, I've been more personal and trying to reach out myself and build those relationships. But I think like the secret is you know you can't say, "Hey man, I like what you do. How do I do it? Can I pick your brain? Let's get a coffee." That's almost like irrelevant. You really need to show up with something that's like a pretty concrete idea, and you need to show you put in some work, right? So I'm talking to people now for my documentary. It's about the history of stunt people. So from Buster Keaton to today, how has that changed over 100 years? It's an overlooked category. There's still no Oscar category for stunts. I see stunts as screenwriting as the 2 overlooked categories, and filmmaking is kind of a relation there. But I'm just reaching out to people, and I'm just having conversations. And I'm at the end, I'm more like, one thing I do now differently that I've never really done before is like, "Hey, who else should I talk to? Who would you recommend?" And that kind of moves me in that direction. Can I keep you updated on what we're doing? Can I share episode 1 with you? Can I show you this thing, what we're doing? Like, you have to be excited. You have to be willing to put in some work. I mean, I think if you're a fiction author, you probably need, I don't know, more than 3 chapters written. You need to show that you're in this for the long haul. You need to show up with something that shows that you've been somewhere with your head down, putting a lot of hours into something. It can't be an idea. Ideas don't matter. It's all about execution. Everybody who's protecting their ideas and not talking about some of those ideas, they're not serious writers. At least that's kind of how I feel about it, aside from maybe Christopher Nolan, because he's earned that to be secretive. But you really, like, if you're going to collaborate with someone, it's not picking their brain. It's like, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. I've done this much on it. I'm probably," you don't really say this part, but the implication is, "I'm going to do this with or without you, but I'd love for you to be a part of it. I see you as XYZ." And I think that's really the only way to really have a conversation like that. So when I had that Walking Dead job, or writing about the TV show, I started having some people on the show, like not real famous people because we were pretty small. But I ended up, someone said, "Hey, do you know this guy, Keith Harris? He lives where you live." And I was like, "What?" Because they shoot in Georgia. I'm in North Carolina. I reached out and I was like, "Hey, I'm doing this show. Would you like to come on it?" We met a couple times. I said, "Hey, I wrote this script," and he happened to be obsessed with the same idea. And he and I are talking about making a TV show together. It's a very long process because it's set in the 1920s, North Carolina, but we agree on the same thing. Some things are intangible, but the underlying part is like, "Here's my project. I'm going to do it. I hope you can be a part of it. It might make sense." And then you really just leave it open for them.
Yeah, I think that's great.
That's
That's a
awesome.
really great
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, that's a fabulous answer because too many people don't want to collaborate, don't know how to collaborate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you're providing something of value to them too. When you're doing the interview, and it's the same thing, on our end when we're interviewing folks, like it's not all me asking you for something. It's I'm providing something to you as well. So I think that's really good. All right.
Mhm.
Before we go, uh, make sure, Brock, to tell people where they can follow you, find you, and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so at Brock Swinson on Instagram and Twitter. I'm kind of new to the platforms, but we're starting to do some stuff every day. But the big thing is just go to brockswinson.com. It'll change some as we kind of add to it. But over the course of this year, I'm giving away Ink by the Barrel, Secrets from Prolific Writers. That's the PDF and the audiobook for free. Our goal is to give away 100,000 copies this year. It's a big, ambitious goal. We've given away a few thousand copies already, so we're super excited about that. But yeah, anyone listening, make sure to grab your copy, tell your friends. It's all at brockswinson.com.
Well, and I will advocate for the book. Like it's personal, it's practical, and gives you lots of ideas of things that you can actually implement. Which for me, when I'm reading a book about craft or productivity, creativity, those are things I want, things that I can put into effect to improve the work that I'm doing. So it definitely provides that.
Yeah, well, I think there is a lot of mindset there. I really want it to be tactical. I want it to be where you could turn to almost any page and walk away with something. And again, it's borrowed authority. It's just throwing a pile of notes and note cards and then putting that together into a book form. And I hope people enjoy it and can kind of turn to it for many years to extend their career as a writer.
Well,
Yes.
thanks, Brock, for your time.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I think that folks are going to take a lot away from it.
Yeah, I think it's going to encourage a lot of people. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.